Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Marie Newton, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will be answering questions throughout the presentation, so please type them into the chat box. If you have further questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to email me, and I will forward them to the appropriate person that can answer them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under Professional Development. And now I'd like to introduce Lisa Steimer, Deputy Executive Director for CABE.
Thanks, Will Marie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And we are really thrilled to have, as you can see, the team from the School and State Finance Project with us today to talk about changes in school funding. I'm not going to take a lot of the time as far as an introduction goes, so I would like to turn the program over to Lisa Hammersley, who is the Executive Director of the School and State Finance Project. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Hi, everyone. As you can see, I have a number of my teammates here with me this afternoon, ranging from our data policy and research teams. So as previously mentioned, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we can certainly answer them as we proceed through the webinar content. Otherwise, if there are any additional questions, we can certainly field those at the end as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start to give a little bit of information as to what occurred in the recent legislative session with education funding. For those of you who are not familiar with the School and State Finance Project, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization, and we work collaboratively with all stakeholders, including policymakers, school district officials, community leaders, to understand all of the data surrounding public school students and to drive more state resources to support students and to do so in an equitable manner. So in the most recent legislative session, the revised budget for the upcoming fiscal year provides over $190 million in supplemental education funding. This is one-time temporary funding that is not a part of existing education funding formulas, meaning the underlying ECS formula, for example, was not altered. This $190 million in supplemental education aid is provided to all public school students. We have here on this chart how that $190 million is broken out. Just shy of $173 million for local and regional public schools, $5.5 million for our rests, $2.75 million for Board of Ed magnets, $8.7 million for state charter schools, and an $800,000 increase provided to our agri-science students. With regards to the funding that was provided to local and regional public school districts, that $172.9 million is comprised of two different grants. One is the Supplemental Education Aid, and the second is the District Relief and Compensatory Use Learning Aid Grant. Acronym of Dracula was intentional by the legislative attorney who drafted this language. But these two grants, as I mentioned, are separate from ECS and Alliance District funding. The funds will be provided directly to municipalities, not directly to districts. And it is noted that these funds will be released in a single payment by October 31 without there needing to be a grant application. The legislation states that funding under these grants must be used for educational purposes only and expended as approved by the local or regional Board of Education. The legislation also specifically states that these supplemental funds will not be included in the minimum budget requirement calculations for the following fiscal year 2028. Now, while the education cost sharing formula was not modified in statute, the grant amounts provided to each town were based in part off of the ECS formula and what districts would receive if several changes were made. The first is that the ECS Foundation was increased from $11,525 to $13,087. And the second modification that the grant amounts reflect is the extension of the ECS Formula's Regional District and Endowed Academy bonus, extending that to districts that do not have a high school and pay tuition to a designated high school. So that second policy change with regards to designated high school tuition to towns, that was actually a policy that was contained in the Senate leadership's education funding priority bill from the most recent legislative session. And so, as you can see, while the ECS formula was not changed, grant amounts were provided to reflect if that foundation was increased to that $13,087, and assuming that this regional district bonus was extended to towns that pay tuition to a designated high school. Under these two changes, 82 towns were calculated to receive an increase in funding in excess of their fiscal year 2027 grant. As a result, these towns will receive a supplemental education aid that equals the difference between this calculation and their fiscal year 2027 ECS grant. However, there are some towns that would not receive an increase in funding, even with that increase in that foundation and that extension of the bonus to designated high school towns. The General Assembly decided that they wanted towns under the Supplemental Education Aid Grant to receive an increase of state support equal to at least 2% of their fiscal year 2027 ECS grant. And so, in order to ensure that every municipality receives an increase, the Supplemental Education Aid Grant provides towns with additional state funding equal to at least 2% of their fiscal year 2027 grant amount. This impacts 87 towns that are provided under the supplemental aid grant, that 2% increase off of their fiscal year 2027 grant. We provided a few examples just to put this calculation, provide a little bit more clarity here for these calculations, and we used Montville. So as you can see, 2% of their fiscal year 2027 ECS grant results in an increase of $256,000. Assuming the theoretical ECS changes that we previously went through, those two changes would result in an increase to Montville of just over $201,000. Because the 2% increase is the larger of the two amounts, that is how much the town of Montville is receiving in supplemental education aid. The legislature then decided to create that Dracula grant, and the Dracula grant is actually funded with a sweep from the probate court administrative funds. It kind of got tacked on after and late in the budget negotiation process. And what the General Assembly decided to do with that $10 million is to provide additional state funding to ensure that all towns received at least a 4% increase or 4% of their fiscal year 2027 ECS grant amounts. Not all towns will receive funding on the Dracula grant because some towns already met or exceeded the 4% threshold under the calculations of the supplemental education aid. Some towns, because of that increase in the theoretical increase in that foundation, already received an increase larger than 4%. So that's why not all towns will receive funding under Dracula. We provided another example calculation here for the town of East Haven. As you can see, 2% of their fiscal year 2027 grant is just over $400,000. The ECS grants, based on the theoretical changes, the supplemental aid is $541,000. Because the $541,000 is larger, the supplemental aid grant is reflective of that theoretical ECS changes of $541,000. However, in order to get the town of East Haven up to the 4% of their fiscal year 2027 ECS grant, they would require an increase in support of $259,000 in order to get up to that 4% amount, which is just over $800,000. So that's what their Dracula grant provides, is the balance between their 4% and how much they received in supplemental aid to get the town up to 4% in total. The legislation provides that municipalities that adopted their fiscal year 2027 budget prior to the passage of the revised state budget, that they have the ability to revise their budgets and potentially reduce mill rates by July 1. This allows municipalities with the fiscal year 2027 budgets to realize the benefits from the supplemental education funding and potentially provide property tax relief to their residents. However, if a town adjusts its previously approved fiscal year 2027 budget, it must provide its local or regional Board of Education with, at a minimum, funding equal to what the town provided in fiscal year 2026, plus the supplemental education funding allocated to the town under the revised budget for fiscal year 2027. However, if under its previously adopted fiscal year 2027, a town provided its Board of Education with an increase greater than the sum of what it provided in fiscal year 2026 and its supplemental education aid, the town cannot provide less to the Board of Ed than it did in its originally adopted 2027 budget. This is a little bit complicated, and so we provided a few examples to put this into context as well. Under this example, a town's MBR is $1 million. As a part of its originally adopted budget, the town provided $1.5 million to its Board of Ed. This town receives a $250,000 grant in supplemental education aid. Because the town provided the Board of Ed with $1.5 million in its adopted budget, it must provide at least that much in its amended budget. However, when amending its budget, the town could use the $250,000 that they received in supplemental education aid and then combine it with $250,000 in local property tax revenue to get to that original additional $500,000 or $1.5 million in total. Or it could provide the additional $500,000 entirely from local revenue and then use that $250,000 in supplemental funding for tax relief. Under this scenario, however, the town cannot provide less than that $1.5 million that it was provided to its local Board of Ed. In this next example, example 2, once again, a town's MBR is $1 million. As a part of its originally adopted budget, the town provided $1.5 million to its local Board of Ed. However, the town received $750,000 in supplemental education aid. Because the town's MBR and supplemental education funding equals $1.75 million, it must provide at least that much to its Board of Ed in its amended budget. When amending its budget, the town could simply provide the full $750,000 in supplemental education funding to the district, or it could increase how much local funding it was planning to give to the Board of Ed by $250,000 for a total increase of $750,000, and then use the $750,000 in supplemental tax relief. However, under this scenario, once again, the town cannot provide less than the $1.75 million that it originally was that it's required to provide as a result of receiving that $750,000 grant from the state in supplemental education aid. As I noted, there was also supplemental funding provided to school choice programs. In total, the amount provided to school choice programs total $17.8 million. And funding appears to be calculated as if the foundation amount for these grants were increased in line with the growth that is allowed under the state spending cap, which is the greater of the percentage increase in personal income, the 5-year average, or the percentage increase in inflation, whichever is higher. So this would theoretically bring choice programs foundation up to $12,210. The General Assembly also provided $100 million in supplemental municipal aid. This supplemental aid is intended to help municipalities manage the rising costs and reduce the burden on local property taxpayers. Once again, this funding is temporary and it's not a part of any existing municipal aid formula and is not expected to continue beyond fiscal year 2027. While these funds can be used to support education, these funds are not required to be used for education purposes. And the method that the General Assembly used to distribute these grants was using the Mashantucket, Pequot, and Mohegan grant formula, which allocates resources to municipalities based on the value of their non-taxable property, their population, and the town's municipal wealth. Municipalities will receive these funds in a single payment by September 30th. Municipalities are required to report to the Office of Policy and Management on how they expended these funds by January 1, 2027. And once again, municipalities that adopted their fiscal year 2027 budget prior to the state budget being passed are allowed to revise their budgets to reduce their mill rates by July 1 in response to the increase in funds from the state. Looking specifically at the ECS formula, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the ECS formula remains unchanged. There were no changes made to any components of the ECS formula in this most recent legislative session. And while the supplemental education aid grant amounts are based off of assuming those adjustments to the ECS formula, the formula was not changed. So those changes will not continue in the future because the formula was not revised to reflect that increase in the foundation. There were minor ECS funding increases provided to only 16 towns to reflect enrollment and demographic changes. All other towns are going to receive the same amount of funding next year, ECS funding next year, than they did receive in fiscal year 2026. However, there appears to be legislative intent that funding that is provided to municipalities, specifically as a result of those two theoretical changes, that funding be added to the appropriation in fiscal year 2028. So there is legislative intent that they want that funding to continue moving forward. However, the budget that passed does not contain or did not contain the necessary language to actually spend those resources in fiscal year 2028. I would presume that because that legislation requires that there be a $152.2 million increase in the appropriation for ECS in fiscal year 2028, that the governor's office, when it releases its budget in the upcoming legislative session, that they would recommend the necessary legislative changes in order to actually effectuate getting these dollars out the door through the formula, which would include increasing the foundation to that $13,087. For towns that are considered overfunded according to the formula, the statute contains that phase out again, beginning again in fiscal year 2028. We know that these towns have been held harmless for the past 3 bienniums. And because this supplemental education funding is not ECS funding, it is not included in the ECS hold harmless provisions that are extended to alliance districts. Because alliance districts have hold harmless provisions that state that they cannot receive less in any year than they received in the previous year. Because this funding is not ECS, all of this money, all the supplemental education aid that alliance districts received are not counted as alliance district funding and therefore are not held to that hold harmless. So theoretically, and not theoretically, but this could happen in fiscal year 2028, alliance districts could receive less in total state funding next year than they would have received in total this year. So this is just something that we flag. This is something to be aware of. Particularly if we see significant shifts in enrollment like we saw in this past legislative session with the governor's budget recommendation that impacted next year's ECS grants. There were also no changes to school choice grant formulas. So, like the ECS formula, the formulas that are extended to public school choice programs did not see any changes legislatively. Funding for magnet schools, charter schools, and agri-science programs were adjusted to reflect updated enrollment and updated student demographics. We continue to be phased in this, what we refer to as the student-centered funding policy program, where the state extends ECS-based funding to magnet schools and agri-science programs in full, which allows for the elimination of general education tuition billing. In 2024, the General Assembly partially extended ECS-based funding to these programs and capped general education tuition. We continue to live with that partial extension and partial cap in this upcoming school year. In addition, charter schools continue to receive 57% of their full ECS-based funding in the upcoming school year as well. RESC magnet operators originally in the biennial budget were due to receive a $12 million increase in fiscal year 2027. Because of that supplemental education aid that was extended to RESC operated magnet schools, the General Assembly decided to reduce that $12 million appropriation to acknowledge the increase in supplemental education aid and therefore reduce the appropriation to $6.41 million. In total, however, the RESC operators will continue to receive that $12 million between the two grants. Formulaic funding for state charter schools will also increase by $5.5 million over current levels to reflect increases in enrollment and updated student need data. In addition, there was a $225,000 increase to make three planning grants, each $75,000 for three new charter schools in the state. My data team is amazing, and they've put together a wonderful model that would allow you to estimate current and future education funding. We have it linked here, and it could help you as you project ECS, Board of Ed magnet school, and agri-science grants. I encourage you all to use it. It allows you to enter different formula components such as enrollment projections and estimates of student need. And get an estimated grant for your town. To do this, you would just need to navigate to the overview sheet and select your town from the drop-down menu highlighted in orange. Special education, the budget provided no increase in funding for the excess cost grant and the special education expansion and development grant, referred to as SEED. We recently scraped the most recent excess cost grant reimbursement requests from districts, and we realized that reimbursement requests have increased by approximately $17.9 million this year, or a 6% increase. Fully funding the grants, statutory tiered reimbursement levels would have required $60 million more than what was appropriated. And due to this significant shortfall, districts will be reimbursed between 66.8% and 71.5% of their eligible costs, unfortunately. This graph shows you, or table shows you the estimated reimbursement tier by where you are in your tiered district. So as you can see, spanning from 66.8% up to that 71.5% for our most high need communities. This graphic just shows you the underfunding again. So $60 million short of what is necessary to fully fund the grant to the statutory reimbursement tiers, or just shy of $96 million short of full funding of this grant. Overall funding for SEED, as I mentioned, it remains flat, so it remains at that $30 million in the upcoming school/fiscal year. Some districts may receive increases or decreases compared to fiscal year 2026 due to changes in their overall special education population or community wealth. We estimate that fully funding the seed grant would require an increase in state support at over $185 million. Because this grant is so significantly underfunded, towns and districts are receiving roughly 16% of their fully funded grant amount. Looking ahead, we have significant work to continue to do. The ECS Foundation statutorily remains at $11,525. This is unadjusted since 2013. That general education tuition billing system remains capped at 58%. We would like to get that to 100 so that districts are no longer paying general education tuition when a student decides to exercise choice and attend a different school type. We also would like all students to obviously receive funding that reflects their individual learning needs so that if you attend a magnet school program, you receive the full ECS-based funding for you and your individual needs. And we continue to flag that special education funding continues to lag behind significantly. As I'm sure you are all aware, the governor has created a Blue Ribbon Commission on Education. And I would imagine that all of these topics will be discussed. And that commission is supposed to recommend their work recommend changes to education funding in January 2027. We look forward to working with all of you on all of these topics. And right now I'll take any questions. I'm not sure if there's any in the chat or if there's any that are remaining. And before I take questions, I'll just share that this is my contact information. If you have any questions after this presentation and you would like to connect directly, please feel free to reach out. And if you have not already done so, please check out our website, which has a wealth of information available for all of you as well. And I'll stop my share. Are all the questions answered, Michael?
Lisa, we have one question that I think we might need just greater clarity from Peter asking. But the question is, I believe that this is a matter of timing. Suppose the town finalized its budget only after the state had already taken action, resulting in the Board of Education allocation arriving post-state action. How would this affect the MBR for the following year?
I don't see that in the chat. So the question is the town adopted its budget after the General Assembly did?
Correct.
So, but because the legislation clearly says that this funding will not be included in the MBR calculation in fiscal year 2028, I don't believe that the timing of when the town acts and actually adopts the budget matters. I'm looking at my team to see if anybody disagrees with me.
It should be as long as the town is committing or sending to the district what it did the previous year plus at bare minimum the supplemental education funding, then you should be fine. And if the town increased education funding for you outside of the supplemental education funding, that could impact the MBR.
That would.
But if they just flat funded you from local revenue and then passed along the supplemental education funding, that would not impact the MBR. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay.
Lisa, can you share the slide with your contact information again?
Absolutely. If you have any particular questions about your individual town or district, please feel free to send them along and we will have a designated individual on the team here look into it and get back to you. We also have a wonderful app, Ed Explorer, that you can also put on your phone, which allows you to get handy data and information in a very accessible manner as well. So I encourage you all to take a look at that app as well, which is up on our website.
Giving it that pause to give people the opportunity to process and ask a question. Oh, well, Marie, do you see that Marjorie has her hand raised?
Yes. Um, would you like, Lisa, would you like me to unmute Marjorie, or would you like her to write her question in the chat?
Oh, you can unmute her.
Okay. Okay. Marjorie, you're able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you. I just did. I don't know that my question, I did write it in the chat. I don't know that it was addressed. Um, my town of North Branford finalized their budget prior to the state finishing their supplemental education legislation. And they originally were giving us 950,000, but our town council supplanted 250,000 of that with state money that came in. And um, so that next year, instead of 950 being the new NBR for 27-28, it will be 700,000. So this legislation hurt us in a significant way. That's 1%. 300,000 is 1% of our budget. So next year, when we look at our budget, we'll be down almost a full percent from where we were funded for the 26-27. So 27-28 is my focus. It's going to hurt us. We're going to lose that 250 because it was only the one-time funding. Do you have any advice, or is there anything legally that we could do? We are speaking to our education attorneys, and but I guess that's just the way it goes, correct? I mean, they were able to supplant that money because of the loophole, I guess, that was written in, or something was removed from the original bill that allowed them to do that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the General Assembly wanted to allow municipalities to use this funding if the budget had already been adopted to allow districts to reduce or to allow towns to reduce the property tax burden on taxpayers. So unfortunately, I don't believe that there's anything that you can do legally because just reading what you put in the chat, it seems that what the town did was consistent with what the legislation provides. I would encourage you, to talk to your legislative delegation and let them know that in the upcoming school year that you are harmed as a result of allowing the town to supplant the money for local resources, but it was clearly legislative intent.
Because it's just a misnomer. It's not really supplemental education funding. It's for towns to lower mill rates. It's not wasn't the
Yeah.
intent. The intent was not to help education, is my opinion.
I hear you, and especially coming from a town that had already increased its contribution to education.
Yeah.
In your case, in the town of North Branford, that is the case. And I think that the General Assembly was feeling a lot of pressure to address the rising property tax burden. And where we were prior to the General Assembly enacting the supplemental education aid is really we were at a crisis point here in the state because with districts overall being held harmless in the upcoming school year, absent anything from the General Assembly, particularly for our more like our communities that simply can't afford an increase in property taxes or are unwilling, those districts, there would have been a lot of cuts for students. And so I think that the General Assembly responded in this manner to try to address one, that impact on our very high need communities, and then two, to help local property taxpayers with increases in property taxes. We would
Okay.
have preferred that they adjusted the ECS formula and that everything
Mhm.
be held to the MBR and, not having these specific carve outs. But this is unfortunately, fortunately, because they did provide at least some support and education aid for students across the state. This is fortunately and unfortunately what the General Assembly decided to do. I'm hopeful that with that Blue Ribbon Commission, maybe we can get some robust recommendations there to change the formula and have everything be counted towards MBR, et cetera. But it does seem, based off of what you said, that your town did not do anything that the legislation did not allow for.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And if I might add, Marjorie, Leonard Lockhart is CABE's representative to the Blue Ribbon Commission. Reach out to him and share your experience with him so that he can share that at the table, as well as, Lisa has heard you as well. And we're happy to give you Leonard's contact information if you
Yes,
need it.
please. Yes, I do. Please. I would like
Okay.
that.
Okay, great. We'll drop it in the chat.
Perfect.
Lisa,
Thank you.
sorry, if I can, I saw that Michael on my team unmuted, so I wanted to see if he had anything to add here for Marjorie.
Yeah, I was gonna, in a similar vein as the other Lisa, add that this is something that we have heard from other communities as well. And so I would encourage any Board of Ed member who is encountering this with their town to reach out to other Board of Ed members in other communities as well. This is something that we've heard that's happened similarly in Hamden, in New London, in Derby, and those are just a couple examples that we have. So I think the more that you can connect with your fellow Board of Education members across town lines and have greater advocacy about this at the Capitol next session, the better and the more effective it will be.
Okay. I do have some contacts in Hamden as well, since that was my former town. So I can certainly do that.
Are there any other questions, comments? Let's see, not seeing any. Lisa or members of your team, any final comments?
No, just thank you all for the ability to work with you today, Lisa, and the entire CABE team. We look forward to working with you in the future.
Great. And thank you to all of you. As those of you participating in the webinar can see, Lisa has a great team assembled here who focus strictly on funding issues and are an incredible resource for all of us. So on behalf of all of us here at CABE, staff, members, our board of directors, thank you to all of you for presenting. And for those of you who participated today, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more that will help you be more effective as you sit at the board table. With that, I'm going to wish you all a wonderful afternoon. The weather looks lovely outside, and enjoy it. And we will be seeing you all soon. Thanks so very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.